The Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, translated by Neville Coghill. The Prologue. When in April the sweet showers fall, and pierce the drought of March to root and all, the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of the flower. When also Zephyrus with his sweet breath exhales an air in every grove and heath, upon the tender shoots, and the young sun his half course in the sign of the ram has run, and the small fowl are making melody, that sleep away the night with open eye, so nature pricks them, and their heart engages. Then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far-off saints, hallowed in sundry lands, and specially from every shire's end. In England down to Canterbury they wend, to seek the holy blissful martyr, quick to give his help to them when they were sick. It happened in that season that one day in Southwark at Tabard as I lay, ready to go on pilgrimage and start for Canterbury, most devout at heart, at night there came into the hostelry some 29 in a company of sundry folk, happening then to fall in fellowship, and they were pilgrims all, then toward Canterbury meant to ride. The rooms and stables of the inn were wide. They made us easy, all was of the best, and shortly, when the sun had gone to rest, by speaking to them all upon the trip, I soon was one of them in fellowship, and promised to rise early and take the way to Canterbury, as you have heard me say. But none the less, while I have time and space, before my story takes a further pace, it seems a reasonable thing to say what their condition was, the full array of each of them, as it appeared to me, according to profession and degree, and what apparel they were riding in. And at a knight I therefore will begin. There was a knight, a most distinguished man, who, from the day on which he first began to ride abroad, had followed chivalry, truth, honor, generousness, and courtesy. He had done nobly in his sovereign's war, and ridden into battle no man more, as well in Christian as in heathen places, and ever honored for his noble graces. When we took Alexandria, he was there. He often sat at table in the chair of honor above all nations. When in Persia, in Lithuania, he had ridden, and Russia, no Christian man so often of his rank. When in Grenada, Algeciras sank. Under assault he had been there, and in North Africa, riding in Benamarn. In Anatolia he had been as well, and fought when Aias, Anatolia fell. For all along the Mediterranean coast he had embarked with many a noble host. In 15 mortal battles he had been, and jousted for our faith. At Tramacene, thrice in the lists, and always killed his man. This same distinguished knight had led the van, once with the Bay of Balat, doing work for him against another heathen Turk. He was of sovereign value in all eyes, and though so much distinguished, he was wise, and in his bearing modest as a maid. He never yet a boorish thing said. In all his life, to any come what might, he was a true, a perfect, gentle knight. Speaking of his equipment, he possessed 5 horses, but he was not gaily dressed. He wore a fustian tunic, stained and dark with smudges where his armor had left mark. Just home from service, he had joined our ranks to do his pilgrimage and render thanks. He had his son with him, a fine young squire, a lover and cadet, a lad of fire, with locks as curly as if they had been pressed. He was some 20 years of age, I guessed. In stature he was of a modest length, with wonderful agility and strength. He'd seen some service with the cavalry in Flanders and Artois and Picardy, and had done valiantly in little space of time, in hope to win his lady's grace. He was embroidered like a meadow bright, and full of freshest flowers red and white. Singing he was, or fluttering all the day. He was as fresh as is the month of May. Short was his gown, his sleeves were long and wide. He knew the way to sit a horse and ride. He could make songs and poems recite, knew how to joust and dance, to draw and write. He loved so hotly that till dawn grew pale, he slept as little as a nightingale. Courteous he was, lowly and serviceable, and carved to serve his father at the table. There was a yeoman with him at his side, no other servant, so he chose to ride. This yeoman wore a coat and hood of green, and peacock-feathered arrows bright and keen, and neatly sheathed hung at his belt the while, for he could dress his gear in yeoman style. His arrows never dropped their feathers low, and in his hand he bore a mighty bow. His head was like a nut, his face was brown. He knew the whole of woodcraft up and down. A saucy brace was on his arm to ward it from the bowstring, and a shield and sword hung at one side, and at the other slipped a jaunty dirk, spear-sharp and well-equipped. A medal of St. Christopher he wore, of shining silver at his breast, and bore a hunting horn, well slung and burnished clean, that dangled from a baldric of bright green. He was a proper forester, I guess. There was also a nun, a prioress. Her way of smiling very simple and coy. Her greatest oath was only by St. Loy, and she was known as Madame Eglantine, and well she sang a service with a fine intoning through her nose, as was most seemly, and she spoke daintily in French extremely, after the school of Stratford at Bow. French in the Paris style she did not know. At meat her manners were well taught. Withal, no morsel from her lips did she let fall, nor dipped her fingers in the sauce too deep, but she could carry a morsel up and keep the smallest drop from falling on her breast. For courtliness she had a special zest, and she would wipe her upper lip so clean that not a trace of grease was to be seen. Upon the cup, when she had drunk to eat, she reached a hand sedately for the meat. She certainly was very entertaining, pleasant and friendly in her ways, and straining to counterfeit a courtly kind of grace, a stately bearing fitting to her place, and to seem dignified in all her dealings. For as for her sympathies and tender feelings, she was so charitably solicitous, she used to weep if she but saw a mouse caught in a trap. If it were dead or bleeding, she had little dogs she would be feeding with roasted flesh, or milk, or fine white bread, and bitterly she wept if one were dead, or someone took a stick and made it smart. She was all sentiment and tender heart. Her veil was gathered in a seemly way, her nose was elegant, her eyes glass grey, her mouth was very small, but soft and red. Her forehead certainly was fair of spread, almost a span across the brows, I own. She was indeed by no means undergrown. Her cloak, I noticed, had a graceful charm. She wore a coral trinket on her arm, a set of beads, the gaudies tricked in green, whence hung a golden brooch of brightest sheen, on which there first was graven a crowned A, and the lower Amor Vincit Omnia. Another nun, the chaplain at her cell, was riding with her, and 3 priests as well. A monk there was, one of the finest sort, who rode the country. Hunting was his sport, a manly man, to be an abbot able. Many a dainty horse he had in stable. His bridle, when he rode, a man might hear jingling in a whistling wind as clear, aye, and as loud as does the chapel bell, where my Lord Monk was prior of the cell, the rule of good Saint Bennet, or Saint Mar, as old and strict he tended to ignore. He let go by the things of yesterday, and took the modern world's more spacious way. He did not rate that text at a plucked hen, which says that hunters are not holy men, and that a monk uncloistered is a mere fish out of water flapping on the pier. That is to say, a monk out of cloister. That was a text he held not worth an oyster, and I agreed and said his views were sound. Was he to study till his head went round, poring over books in cloisters? Must he toil as Austin bade, and till the very soil? Was he to leave the world upon the shelf? Let Austin have his labor to himself. This monk was therefore a good man to horse. Greyhounds he had, as swift as birds to course. Hunting a hare, or riding at a fence, was all his fun. He spared for no expense. I saw his sleeves were garnished at the hand with fine grey fur, the finest in the land, and on his hood to fasten at his chin he had a wrought gold cunningly fashioned pin. Into a lover's knot it seemed to pass. His head was bald, and shone like a looking-glass. So did his face, as if it had been greased. He was a fat and personable priest. His prominent eyeballs never seemed to settle. They glittered like the flames beneath a kettle. Supple his boots, his horse in fine condition. He was a prelate fit for exhibition. He was not pale like a tormented soul. He liked fat swan best, and roasted whole. His palfrey was as brown as is a berry. And that is where we will stop for now. When we next return, we will hear about what the friar looked like. Thank you very much for watching. I had one more shout out that I forgot to give, and that is for Mary Ellen Katz, who does video game walkthroughs. I will put a link to her channel at the bottom of this video. We will see you next time.